This is Pastor Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Matthew chapter 26, verses 47 to 56. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on March 15, 2026. Part of our series called Transforming Conflict, How We Can Hold Others in Life's Disruptions. So let's hear the text beginning at Matthew 26, verse 47, with Jesus speaking. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign previously, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, arrest him." And immediately Judas went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. And behold, one of those who were there with Jesus reached and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way?" At that time Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a man inciting a revolt? Every day I used to sit within the temple grounds teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets will be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. We're going to look at this text in three different sections. I'll begin by talking about Judas's betrayal in verses 47 to 51, and then we'll turn to verses 52 to 54, where Jesus explains the true nature of his kingdom, and then finally verses 55 and 56, when Jesus speaks to the crowd itself. So let's just look first at Judas's betrayal in verses 47 to 51. This entire text that we've just read is a critical text, and it has versions in all four Gospels. But it's often read as a part of Holy Week services. And so we don't often have time to pause and to wonder and pray and meditate on what is in this text outside of those settings. So we're going to take that pause now to study the text in more detail, to find deeper truths about Jesus' final hours. The text opens in verse 43 by saying that while Jesus was still speaking, it's referring to his discussion that he had with the disciples when he had come back a third time and found them asleep while he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, while that conversation between Jesus and his disciples was taking place, Judas arrives, but this time he arrives with large crowds with swords and clubs, the text tells us. Now, this little bit of information tells us that this group was a mixture of Jewish temple guards, they would have clubs, along with a detachment of Roman soldiers who would be carrying swords. Now, typically speaking, the temple guards would not carry swords, they would carry clubs, and so that's how we kind of are tipped off that this is a mixture of kind of two different groups, one being guards, the other being soldiers. Now, we hear next where these people came from. It says they came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now remember, in Jerusalem in this day, there's a Jewish temple, a very quite large temple, refurbished and remodeled by Herod the Great. It's quite large, so the chief priests have very active religious activity in Jerusalem. So when we read about priests in the Bible, we recognize that there aren't any priests today within Judaism. Judaism is exclusively rabbinic in its style, which would kind of be a descendant movement of the Pharisees and the scribes. So these chief priests and elders of the people were oftentimes closely aligned with Roman authorities in and around Jerusalem. And so it wouldn't surprise us that the chief priests and elders of the people would be able to secure some Roman soldiers to come along to this engagement with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew makes it clear that the garrison is under license from religious leaders. It's their authority that has brought these people there. Now, in verse 48, it tells us, as kind of almost an afterthought of what arrangement Judas had made, and that Judas would point out Jesus to the guards and the soldiers with a kiss. Now, the kiss was a customary way to people would greet each other in the ancient world. Kind of imagine a kiss on each cheek. It's still very, very common today in many parts of the world to greet a person with a kiss like that on each cheek, even if it is somewhat kind of symbolic as you see people moving their head from side to side. It's still a very, very common custom. And so this is exactly what happens in this story. So a kiss on Jesus's cheek is not strange. It's in many ways normal. Well, why is this needed? Why does Judas need to indicate who Jesus is? Well, it's possible that the guards and the soldiers didn't even recognize him, so they didn't know who it was. So instead of Judas showing up at the garden and pointing at Jesus and say, it's that man, he simply identifies him with a kiss. Now, verse 49 arrives, and we find that Judas takes action. So verse 48 is kind of a backward reflection of the arrangement Judas had made. Verse 49 takes us back into the story that's in front of us. Now, the story reads that there's no hesitation on Judas's part. It says he immediately comes before Jesus, and he says two things to him, two words. The first one is greetings, and this is the common way to say hello. And then he says, Rabbi. Now, it's important to note that he does not use the word Lord in address of Jesus, but a little bit more of a distant word, Rabbi. And so Jesus' response to what Judas has said is just as interesting. Jesus responds to him by saying, friend. It's a very informal way of addressing him. It signals that in many ways, Judas is still in Jesus' circle of affection. Now, of course, the gospel writers themselves, they vilify Judas, which we do not see as much here from Jesus' own words. He addresses him as friend, and we don't take that to be sarcastic. We take that to be exactly what it appears to be, that he still sees capacity and agency and freedom within Judas, even if Judas can't see it himself. And then comes a really cryptic statement. It's really difficult to translate into English. It literally says, for this you have come. It's almost like, well, here you are. Let's get on with it. It signifies that Judas's role has now come to a fruition. The text then tells us that they laid hands on Jesus and they arrested him. Now, this whole episode happens very quickly. The language Judas and Jesus use with one another is familiar, which makes us wonder, what does Judas's betrayal really mean? Well, there's some options for us to think about, and they're not necessarily exclusive of each other. It could be a kind of a mixture of any of these. Is he on one hand trying to trigger a militant response from Jesus? Does Judas believe that Jesus is the disguised Messiah and that he simply needs to give Jesus an opportunity to throw off his disguise and to take up arms against the Romans? Or is he playing his divine part in this unfolding drama of redemption? Does Jesus and Judas, for that matter, understand themselves as players in this great unfolding drama in roles that in many ways they were destined to hold? Another option might be, is Judas disillusioned with Jesus and has grown weary of waiting for Jesus to do something, and so this is his way of kind of either rejecting, spurning Jesus' teaching or forcing him to do something. The text isn't clear about his motivation. It almost makes it sound like he just did it out of pure greed for 30 pieces of silver. No matter how we speculate about this, the end result is the same, and it is Jesus' arrest. And it opens a key passageway for us, and it might be surprising for us to think about it this way, but here it is, that those closest to us can inflict the greatest of harm. Those closest to us can inflict the greatest of harm. You know, the affectionate terms that Jesus and Judas use for one another betrays their real sense of disappointment. We all know those who know us well can do the greatest of harm. And so this disappointment that Judas has, this disappointment that Jesus has is very real. And what is missing between Judas with his relationship with Jesus is Judas's transparency and openness, his honesty. He's not clear nor has been clear with Jesus. He simply comes to the garden and is prepared to force Jesus to do something. So the threat here is not some external actor. It's not somebody else coming in outside the story. It's Judas and Jesus who have been in a relationship with each other, a closeness together. So we would need to keep in mind this key passageway that with those who are close to us, that we need to never allow things to go unsaid or for pain to be pushed away. We need to find ways to communicate and to be honest and to be clear about what's happening. And so we have to really pay attention to those closest to us, because if those relationships aren't clear, then tragedy can happen. And this is the case with Judas and Jesus. I wouldn't say, of course, it's the case with Jesus with Judas, but it's certainly Judas's case. His lack of transparency that Jesus can read right through really contributes to this painful moment that happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now we turn to verses 52 to 54, which is really about the nature of the kingdom, and it's kind of the next page in this chapter. The story unfolds with details that differ between the gospel. Other gospels tell us the names of some of the people that are involved in this incident with the sword, what happened afterwards. These other accounts tell us about a healing that takes place where this ear that gets cut off of the high priest is healed by Jesus, and some of the other gospel stories don't tell us about a healing. Now, Matthew's focus here in the way he writes his gospel is on the collision between the kingdom of God and that of the kingdom of human beings. It's a collision between those worlds. So verse 51 tells us that one of the disciples draws a sword. Well, we can pick up John's gospel and read that it is Peter that is the one who draws the sword. And it says that he struck the servant of the high priest. Well, we know from one of the other gospels that high priest assistant, the servant of the high priest, his name is Malchus. And so his ear gets cut off. So it's ironic in every way that Jesus has told the disciples plainly what would happen to him, that he would be betrayed and handed over to the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. Too bad the disciples did not listen to this. So Jesus offers a powerful rebuke to the person who drew their sword, which we know from the other gospel, the Gospel of John, is Peter, with a statement that many of us know. He tells them, first, put your sword back into its place. In other words, to sheath it, that the sword should not be active. And then Jesus delivers an axiom, like a truth. Those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Is this a teaching of pacifism? Perhaps it is. The clearest sense of what Jesus says seems to imply that. But notice how he phrases it, though. Those who take up the sword. So we might ask ourselves, who are those? It could be that he could be speaking about those whose first response is to violence. Their first movement is to take up a weapon. And Jesus seems to say that living by the sword or by violence will bring about our own end through violence, that violence begets violence in some way. And so we need to hear that statement of Jesus clearly, but we need to hear it in the context in which it happens here in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, verse 53 contains a rhetorical question for everyone there. He makes the statement, he says, don't you think I can appeal to my Father? So Jesus commands authority under the Father, that the Father would send 12 legions of angels to his assistance at a moment's notice. Well, how many is 12 legions? Well, a Roman legion of soldiers was 6,400 men. So 12 times 64, it's well over 70,000. 12 times 6,400 is a huge number. And the number 12, though, is much more important in some ways because it relates to the tribes of Israel and the number of disciples. The number 12 is significant here. And the verse, in some ways, harkens back to the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. It's the same temptation that Jesus would throw himself off the temple and God would send his angels to catch him. It's the same thing, but now instead of in abstraction. So before, when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he hadn't done any of his earthly ministry yet. And so it was a way of preempting that. Now it's real. It's in a moment in which the outcome is completely possible that Jesus could be arrested, have a trial, and be executed. So it's the same temptation, but now amplified. So verse 54 brings the integrity of the whole situation forward. Jesus is no fatalist. He has choice and he has agency, and the devil knows it. In this temptation in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus says, how would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen this way? So Jesus faces his most difficult temptation, which will only get worse over the next 15 to 16 hours. This event we're reading likely happened around 11 p.m. at night. And so Jesus has at his disposal the calling of angels from heaven to rescue him from this moment all the way up until the moment of his death at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 15, 16 hours later. It's a key passageway for us to center on. That spiritual integrity is making the hardest choice to do what is right. Jesus practices a form of integrity to his mission and call, which has no rival. Like his temptation in the wilderness, he makes the harder choice to do what is right, not for him or for his benefit, but for us. He had every reason to not go to the cross, yet it is the choice he makes for us and all the world to fulfill God's purpose and call on his life. Not when it was easy. To be honest, it was easier at his temptation to face this. But now at the moment when it's the hardest moment of all, Jesus has spiritual integrity. And it's a lesson we need to hear as well, that integrity is not something we have in the ease of circumstance, but integrity is revealed in some of the most difficult and challenging moments that we face in life. Now we turn to the last two verses in our text, verses 55 and 56, that focus on the nature of the betrayal that Jesus is dealing with the crowd. Jesus first speaks to Judas at the beginning of our story, and then he speaks to the one who we know as Peter, wielding the sword. But now he turns and speaks to the crowd that has come out to him in the garden. And he asks another rhetorical question which cuts to their integrity, as contrasted with his own. Jesus has his, but what about theirs? What about their integrity? He asks this question, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as a man inciting a revolt? It's such a keen and powerful question. Jesus knows their fears. They are afraid that if he is not removed, that the Romans might see the work and actions of Jesus as a revolt. So their hand is motivated by political pressure to not annoy the Romans. Since so many people gathered to hear him in the temple, they dare not risk defending their choice in public. So Jesus calls out their cowardice as a means of enacting a greater work of salvation. Jesus tells them, I sat in the temple every day, and you didn't do anything. Well, why now? Again, Jesus points to the scriptures being fulfilled, because Matthew often focuses on this truth of scripture being fulfilled. Now, once they see that Jesus is not going to fight them with violence, it says all the disciples left him and fled. The truthfulness of the moment and Jesus' integrity to his mission finally shines a light on human intent. Judas betrays him. The chief priest and the elders want to remove him, and the disciples leave him. When it comes down to it, at the bottom line, when the moment of Jesus' mission doesn't get clarity, he has clarity in how he's talked about it, but the moment it becomes real in actions and behaviors, then it opens up a terrible outcome. That Jesus is betrayed at every level. His incarnate suffering continues in experiences of alienation even before his death. And it's a key passageway for us, that true faith and trust shine a light into every dark place. When Jesus stands in solidarity with the will of the Father, it's like light shining forth. So every dark recess of Judas, every dark recess of the religious leaders, and every dark recess of the disciples is completely exposed. There's no hiding. So when Jesus manifests or brings forward his sense of integrity to God's mission for his life, it shines a light on everyone else, that every dark corner of life is opened up to the redeeming love of God. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we willing to live that life of faith and trust that shines a light into every dark place? Sometimes we don't want the light getting there. And it's not so much that God doesn't know what's there, it's that we are not sure we want to hold that yet. We want to understand it. So we're always wrestling with this question of whether we should let the light shine. Are we ready to allow ourselves to be fully exposed to who God says we are? I want to thank you for listening to the First Free Methodist Church podcast. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them all right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.